Julian, thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. As I just mentioned to you there, after seeing an intro and an abstract to one of your scholarly papers alluding to scholarly bullshit and the number of mentions the word bullshit got, you immediately had my attention, sir. And so I'm very looking forward to this conversation today.
Thanks. Excited to be here and happy that paper made another wave. Apparently, it's a few years now. It's a paper that got me into a lot of trouble, but still one of the paper I'm most proud of, and certainly also something that having written it was a good time and constitutes part of good life for me, I'd say.
So, as you're aware, we jump straight in with, is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
I think it's a fantastic question to ask. Um, so I think the short answer is no. There's not a single question I explore. Um, I think there's a bunch of questions I explore. I'm extremely curious, and I think, in a sense, yeah, if I may turn normative for a moment, I think everyone ought to explore as many questions as possible in their lives. I think, though, if I make it a bit more specific, um, I think the one thing that also comes back to this bullshit paper now that always gets me off, or let me start in terms of like what I explore is, uh, I think something that really drives me is I spend a lot of time thinking about how to translate knowledge into useful practical application. I think that's a kind of like theme I've been chewing on for many years. Maybe you could say something on a more specific layer I explore through life. And coming back to that bullshit paper, Mark, I mean the paper is called Bullshit in the Sustainability and Transitions Literature, a Provocation. The point I'm making in the paper is that there's a lot of literature out there that's being written not for the sake of insight, but just for the sake of having another paper. And that is something that upsets me a lot. That's why I wrote kind of like this parody about it, that academics just write for the sake of having another paper instead of insight. And you could say, I guess, in a sense that on a more specific level, this question of how do you translate abstract insight into practice, that's for sure something I'm exploring. I continue to explore.
And just that sentiment of, seeing this proliferation of papers without insight. What is it particularly about that irks you in some way?
Yeah. So I I guess it all stems from a kind of like rather idealistic view of how the academy, of how academia should be, which is that ideally you have these scholars that chew on the questions that fascinate them most, and they chew on them on a long time. And at some point, they come up with this grand insight, and the grand insight translates into this practical innovation and makes the life better for many people out there. I think that's my kind of like very idealistic view of how the academy should be. And when I was a core part of the academy, it may be good to say also a few sentences about like what I do and what I did. I I realized every day that there's a huge delta between this idealistic idea of the academy and how the academy really is. So very concretely, I did the bachelor's, I did the master's, I did a PhD, and I loved doing my PhD so much because I felt like this just following your interests and then translating that into something kind of like that's helpful. This is very much my PhD. I can expand on it in a second of interest. And then right after my PhD, I was lucky enough to become a professor, assistant professor at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And in a sense, I thought, wow, now it's going to be like I'm living the good life, because like what I loved during my PhD, just like this knowledge exploration, hoping to find something that's useful, I can do this now for the rest of my life. And I can tell you, Mark, it at least to me emotionally, it felt very different because I felt, and this is not on Utrecht now, I think more broadly the academic system, that once I was in this like tenure track system, yeah, so I was just like I was a basically trial professor. Everything I was pushed to do, or I felt I was pushed to do, was to get more citations. Yeah? Everyone cared so much about citations, and to get more grants. Yeah, those were the two things I felt that mattered most in the academic system. And it didn't even matter like once you got a grant, like what exactly you would do and what was the output of the research project. It was just all about like, now great, you have one grant, get the next grant, and then write something that gets a lot of citations. And in the very beginning, I started playing that game. And the first paper I wrote at Utrecht University, you may have also seen it, was conceptualizing the circular economy, an analysis of 114 definitions. And it was a paper where I looked at 140 definitions of this buzzword circular economy, and I proposed the 115th definition. And I myself thought, well, what a joke, right? But then I went to academic conferences, people came to me, they shook my hand, they said, what a fantastic paper. And the paper completely took off because academics love definitions. They don't love solutions. They don't love practical stuff. I'm being very pointed. Obviously, that's
Yeah.
not true in its entirety, but a lot of folks just love this paper. And I thought, wow, this paper just embodies everything that's wrong with the academy. The paper completely took off. I'm in a sense famous in my literature. The paper has like 10,000 citations. It's the second most cited paper in my literature. And I was just like, oh my God. Like, I mean, this paper is just kind of like chewing on these kind of like nuances and details of this word. And I've written so much other stuff that I think is so much more helpful, and nobody cares about that. How sad is that? And check mark in terms of like that paper got me a lot of citations. If you a lot of citations, you're going to get a lot of grants. I also got a big grant when I was in Utrecht. And yeah, that just kind of like irked me and frustrated me. And I couldn't take that delta between like my idea of academia, the reality of academia. And then in the end, I quit my job as a tenure track assistant professor. I said, I'm going to live a different model. For 7 years, I've been living the model. I call it pracademia of a pracademic. So my main job is in consulting. I spent most of my week in consulting, and then I still have a kind of like small position at the university, but it's basically a day, less than a day that I spent in uni stuff. A much better model for me, and it's a model that allows me to kind of like be independent of kind of like these constraints or these demands the academic system gives to you, and it also gives me the independence to write a paper such as Bullshit in the Sustainability Transition Literature, a paper that upset many and that I probably wouldn't have written if I was a full-time academic.
Just something you brought up there and there's much that you brought up there that I'd like to explore, but the significance to you of having the freedom to follow your interests. When you said that, I just think that seems to be probably a somewhat underappreciated aspect of people experiencing their own sense of a good life. Just from your point of view, could you tell me the significance of that for you?
Yeah, I think for me, it's one of the core sources of happiness. In that sense, you could also say one of the core sources of a good life. I'd call that autonomy, right? So I really value autonomy. And honestly, Mark, I think we live in a world where no matter where we go, even in academia, where everyone says, oh, you should be like, it's all about academic independence, you should be free to do what you want. There's not that much autonomy, actually. And I think you gotta, or at least if you appreciate autonomy, you gotta fight for your autonomy. And I think like the life I've built now is basically, I mean, it's in a sense a portfolio career, right? I have my kind of like consulting job, I have my academic job, in a sense that actually gives me a lot of freedom, a lot of autonomy, because I can always kind of like, I play with these kind of like identities a bit. And that allows me then to probably, kind of like in the end with these two kind of like professional identities, explore a lot more what I want to do than if I just kind of like followed this kind of like single career.
And what was it like? I've read that you completed your PhD very quickly. You're fast tracked into being almost towards tenure in a university. Um, what was that realization like? Of okay, academia is not what it may seem to me. Like, was that a difficult thing to absorb? Did you resist it? How would you kind of describe that experience?
Yeah, that was a very terrible experience, to put it bluntly. And so if you'd ask me like at the age of like 17 or something, like, what do I want to be? I would have told you I want to be a professor. I want to write some papers, some books that shape what governments do, how businesses operate, right? I really had this idea that you can have such a huge amount of positive impact if you do academic work. And so I was very keen to jump into my PhD. I couldn't wait for it. I spent some time at McKinsey before that. The only reason was because McKinsey promised me to pay for my PhD, and I said, "Great deal." I spent 17 months of kind of like McKinsey life, and then kind of like took the money to do my PhD. And as I said before, like my PhD experience as such, I picked my own topic. I worked on something very niche, something very odd, something I really love. I looked into the socioeconomic impacts of dams, hydropower dams in northern Myanmar. Yeah, and I explored, kind of like resettlement impacts. But what I really also looked into is I looked into anti-dam movements. So I looked into how people, oftentimes illiterate, can't read and write, how they fought these dams in countries such as Myanmar, and sometimes successfully fought them. Right. So it's a bit the story of like David and kind of like Goliath. And I kind of like I've wrote in my papers about like how those folks staged their protests and in the end stopped these like huge projects run by the Chinese government. And to me, that was a very kind of like fascinating questions. I went on to kind of like BBC, etc., to share about it. I had some environmental activists in Germany contact me about it because they also wanted to know like how to run such campaigns. And that was something I loved, right? So my PhD was really, I think it was probably some of the best kind of like years or month in my 20s. I really loved it. And I had this idea that it's just going to continue once I go into this like tenure track. So obviously it was very soul crushing. I was very soul crushing. Before I quit, I was sometimes in the shower for like an hour or two in the morning, and my wife said, "We gotta change something." And so it was a shit experience. It was a shit experience. And I think in the end, for me now, I turned it into something that I find beautiful. That's for me the good life, right? I do academia now at 100% my own terms. I don't listen to anyone in terms of like what I should do, what I should not do. But it was a journey to get there, and there was certainly also some real lows on that journey.
That's that sounds fascinating to me as well, though, that you at 17 you had such a clear sense that this is what you wanted to do. Was this like through your teens? Was this something that you just had clarity on, or how did this even emerge?
It's a it's a great question. I think it's partially driven, for sure, also by my family. So my parents are both kind of like teachers. And my mom actually never worked as a kind of like teacher, but she was a kindergarten teacher. And I think obviously like such a background gives you some kind of like exposure to kind of like appreciating the education system. Yeah, for sure that shaped me. And then I think second, I've just probably always been a bit of a kind of like nerd on the nerdy side. I just always love to read, to absorb knowledge as much as possible. And then if you ask me also as like a teenager, like who would I admire? It was oftentimes the kind of like professors that were very visible, present in the public discourse. So Milton Friedman, one of the great economists of the kind of like 20th century, fantastic economist, but also very active in shaping economic policy of countries, was really someone like in my like teens at like 17, I looked up to, and I kind of like read his books and his papers, etc. In Germany, also kind of like couple of economists I kind of like similarly. So this was something which fascinated me, and then I kind of like developed this desire of like that should be one day when I'm kind of like old and gray.
It's I'm always so intrigued as to when people realize something like this, and obviously there's multiple recalibrations through the course of some people's lives. Like people that I've interviewed, I remember interviewing a guy called Thomas More who wrote this book, Care of the Soul, and he joked that he wanted to be a classical musician, he wanted to be a professor, and he wanted to be a priest, and he ended up being a best-selling author or something to this effect. But it's always, I think, when people are gripped by something at a young age, it sticks out to me because I don't think I necessarily was gripped by something with much clarity at that age, if you get me. From just when you mentioned the theme of your PhD, that sounds absolutely fascinating. What was it about that that how did you even discover that, and how did you carry that forward?
So obviously there was a bit of a coincidence in it. So I did my second master's at the National University of Singapore, and I worked for a professor called Asad K. Biswas. He's one of the big gurus in water policy. And that got me interested in anything related to kind of like to water policy. And then I did my master thesis. I'm actually on a different topic though, which was microfinancing in Myanmar. I traveled to Myanmar for my master thesis. And while I was like in Myanmar, I realized that everyone in this country is talking about these hydropower dams and how the Chinese built these hydropower dams and how people are resettled and nobody can do anything against it. And then there was also this story, though, that there's this one dam that the Chinese just can't complete. The Mutsun Dam in Kashin State in the very north would have been one of the top 15 largest dams in the world. Huge project that just Chinese just can't complete it, haven't completed until today, because there's this movement against the dam. The dam is being built on what the Burmese consider a holy river, the Irrawaddy River in Myanmar. And I just thought, wow, that sounds so fascinating, right? I mean, it's just kind of like there's these like village people, illiterate, and there's the kind of like Chinese government trying to put this dam on their river, and they just can't do it, right? And I think that obviously the theme here that fascinated me, and I think there's something that fascinated me in a kind of like variety of expressions, you could say, was that I think anyone can have an outsized impact if kind of like if one just kind of like goes all in. I think that's kind of like the big message of this kind of like anti-dam movement. And I just said basically then I want to explore that and I want to understand how they did it. I looked obviously during my PhD also in a lot of different anti-dam movements, and I basically like I developed that topic like even like in the late days of my master thesis. And then I started approaching professors, pitching that to them. At some point, I found a professor at the University of Oxford, Christina Charles, who said that's actually interesting. I'm also interested in high power dams. I myself have never worked on the topic. Don't expect me to know anything about it, but I appreciate that you seem very passionate about it. So let's dive into it together. And that's how my kind of like my PhD journey started.
What a gorgeous sentiment, though. Anyone can have a totally outsized impact. What was it like to be in contact with that on a very like repeated basis? And do you sense that it shaped you much by being in contact with such a theme?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, Mark. I think it emboldened me for life, right? Or I mean, let's see, maybe at some point it fades, but it emboldened me for life because obviously, so I did my field research then in Kashin State, northern Myanmar, and talked to these folks. Obviously, they didn't speak English, and I also didn't speak the local language, so I had a translator with me. But still, just from like the gestures, right, and the facial expression, like I could still kind of like I couldn't understand a single word, and I still, even without the translator, was like getting what these folks were telling me, and the incredible amount of energy they were putting kind of like into this movement. And I think it's fair to say that kind of like what those folks there in northern Myanmar achieved, like in a sense, also like what I took away for life was that doesn't matter what folks say, if you yourself believe in it, stick to it, and most of the times like you can break that wall, you can make that dam being never built, right? So to give a very concrete example, in 2018 I kind of like quit my assistant professorship at Utrecht, and I still felt like I wanted to have still a foot in the academy, right? And whenever I just like, started alluding to it, people would also tell me it's impossible. You can't have a life as an academic, the life as a McKinsey consultant, because the McKinsey life, it's all in. Like you will have no time to do anything else, right? And I just continued for 5 years. I continued kind of like writing my papers. Actually, it fueled me. Telling me it's impossible to do this. It really kind of like it was my fuel. And at some point, I was partner. Now, as partner, you kind of like own a chunk of the company, so kind of like you've people give you more autonomy. And then I started sharing more openly. And my sense is now McKinsey is super proud, of the fact that I'm also a very very highly cited academic alongside being a partner at McKinsey. But yeah, in a sense, you could say like those folks in Myanmar, they emboldened me to just say, yeah, whatever. Let people say what they want to say, but if I want to do this, I'm gonna kind of like try this out now. Huh?
Did that create any tension for you to do both side by side, but without the explicit permission side of it?
Yeah. So honestly, I think so I don't want to sound salesy or anything, but McKinsey is. Some folks would disagree, but I think McKinsey is a fantastic organization in the sense that one of the mantras in McKinsey is, and people really live by it, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. Huh? And I think that's a great mantra that obviously kind of like I also kind of like lived by when I started my academic life. So there's um, there's a high level of acceptance of people following their passions. Another mantra in McKinsey is like build your own McKinsey. So there's a lot of kind of like a lot of the DNA of the place is actually kind of like quite open to doing your own thing. And last but not least, many folks don't know, James McKinsey himself was actually a professor at the University of Chicago before he founded McKinsey. So there's a great appreciation of academic work in McKinsey. There's also a couple of more folks that have kind of like somehow entertained some kind of connection to academia, which obviously then also helped me. And by now, and a bit proud to say this, kind of like there's more and more younger folks now also kind of like going into the direction of a pre-academic, remaining kind of like a postdoc 10% while working at McKinsey. And they obviously also now use me as a precedent. Yeah, they say Julian has done it, so I also can do it. And I'm happy about that because I think it's helpful. And again, coming back to this theme we explored in the very beginning, how do you translate knowledge into practice? I think a fantastic way is actually to have two jobs, to have a job of an academic and to have a job of a consultant. And in an ideal world, I always say on my Fridays, I come up with some new knowledge in my kind of like academic world. And then from Monday to Thursday, I apply that in the real world. Obviously, the reality is a lot more messy and it oftentimes doesn't work like this at all. But I still think like there's a tiny bit in this idealistic idea that does work. And I receive quite a few LinkedIn messages each and every week of people asking me, like, how's this even possible? Why do you do it? It fascinates me doing academia and consulting at the same time. So I think there's I think a lot of people have this like urge and have this feeling that we need to have more of a bridge between academia and practice. And I think a model as the model, like I've been living now for 7 years, this like pre-academic model is maybe one way to kind of like build this bridge and build a bit of a like stronger bridge.
Just when you mentioned there, in theory, the idea of kind of applying this knowledge, then, but you said obviously that doesn't always work out in practice. What are some of the limitations you find to implementing what could seem like an ideal still?
Yeah. So I think a major limitation, obviously, is that any consultancy also needs to earn money. And sometimes academia is ahead of the game in topics. So there's a topic that may be debated very widely in academia, but it may not have kind of like landed yet among practitioners. So it's not something you can actually kind of like generate project business with. So very specifically also in my example, I mean, obviously I came back to McKinsey. My research now is like sustainability, circular economy. And I said, well, I want to be kind of like the guru within McKinsey consulting on circular economy. And I came in and there was just not very much business on circular economy. That changed a bit kind of like during this like Fridays for Future or something like 4 years ago. Right now, it's very quiet again. People talk about Gen AI. Very few people talk about sustainability. So to cut a long story short, even though I had a lot of research that I thought was also useful research on circular economy, kind of like I entered a market in the private sector where most of the time it was very difficult to kind of like land projects. So actually within McKinsey, I pivoted into a completely different direction, as you have to when you want to stick around, which was I started working, first of all, on education, also tiny. And then from education, I went into corporate academies. And from corporate academies, I went into HR topics. So right now I do like HR, reorganizations, process optimization, probably 70% of my time. Very different to the research I do. In a sense, I do enjoy that because I love exploring a variety of topics, but it wasn't my original plan. So I think to come back to your questions, I think one of the constraints obviously is like you're operating in the private sector. You got to find something that actually generates project business. But again, to close, given that I now have a topic that like sparks a lot of interest and there's a lot of like activity around it, I obviously still try to kind of like carve out a bit of my time to also push consulting on circular economy, right? And sometimes it works. Like right now, I have a PhD student who's working on circular cities. So cities that try to maximize recycling, increase reuse, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a fantastic PhD project. And throughout the project, we have already convinced 2 cities to turn circular. And one of the cities actually agreed to do like a really kind of like big, chunky project with us with like implementation support that we're doing via McKinsey. So that's obviously something where, yeah, I'm very excited. I mean, you have this like piece of research. My PhD student looked at 29, 30 different cities. And then cities actually find that so exciting that they say, okay, let's spend time on this together and let's work on this. And that's the ideal world for me, yeah, that I would love to be in each and every day. Truth is, yeah, it happens much less frequently than I would hope, but it's okay to, even if it happens like once a year or twice a year, I still think it's fantastic and it excites me and it gives me a lot of energy when I get up in the morning. Yeah.
There seems to be a delightful combination of things in that, like, you're a dreamer and then you're responsive to reality or pragmatic, but neither seems to dim the other, if you know what I mean. That there's still, even if it's like, then okay, well, if an opportunity comes along for, let's say, circular economy in this case, I'm going to take it, and something comes along. There seems to be it would be hard to pigeonhole your perspective, if you get me.
Yeah, I think you're correct. So I'm for sure ruthlessly pragmatic. I think you gotta be, otherwise you get crushed in the world out there. But I think, as you say, you also have to never stop watching out for good moments to be very idealistic again. And the moment will come, and then you got to be ready, and you got to cut into it and make the most out of it. Yeah.
You know, you said something that I think I recognized initially when I did all these interviews. I interviewed 120 people privately, and one thing always stood out to me was how someone had a very senior and busy corporate role, and they were losing connection to it, just maybe elements of burnout or whatever it may be. And they just picked up a woodworking class once at the weekend, and it turned into a something that they're really fascinated in. And while it never became their commercial outlet, you know, he showed me some pieces that he carved, and was doing some really beautiful work. When you mentioned the significance of maintaining academia as well, and also, you know, the energy that that would give you, there seems almost something counterintuitive to that, that you have 2 roles and you might be drained or burnt out. But I've similar experiences, I sense, in just in terms of certain work giving me total energy, and it actually emboldening or enlivening the other bits of work that I may be doing. Could you touch on that a little bit more? Just the significance of some of, or even moments where some of the work that you were doing academically really fueled you.
Yeah. Um, so I lack practical experience. So I struggle to put a light bulb up. Yeah. So also the woodwork wouldn't be something for me. But I think my type of woodwork is my academic work, right? My research, my writing. I oftentimes like to say like I'm a hobby academic. Yeah, I'm a hobby professor. Because indeed it is something that, yeah, I do for like pure pleasure. It's really kind of like my fun activity. So if I had a kind of like long week and I've had a day again with like 20 calls, which obviously happens in my job, uh, it gives me energy. If in the evening I can still kind of like scroll through 1 or 2 academic papers or kind of like write another section in my own paper or give some input on some of the ideas my PhD students put together. So it's really for me something, um, it's a it's a pure source of energy for me that also fuels me for my kind of like consulting life. And again, I think the reason for that is because I just said, guys, I'm doing this 100% at my own terms. I'm not listening to kind of like any of the demands any longer that this academic system is giving me, grants, citations. I'm just really doing this at my own terms. And at least for me, that made academia turn from something that kept me in the shower in the morning for 2 hours to something where, it makes me now jump out of the shower very quickly because I want more time to spend on this.
How do you relate to those experiences in the shower now?
Yeah, no, I think it's. I mean, as I said, I mean, it's. I think we all experience this at some point in life, right? If there's something you worked very hard towards to, and you felt like you kind of like gave everything you had to kind of like make it happen, and you had this extremely idealistic vision of how it would be, and then kind of like life comes and life's different and it crushes you. I mean, it's tough, obviously. I think we all kind of like go through this. I think the big question always is like once you're in such a moment, like is there a way to kind of like turn this into something that actually becomes positive again and it becomes kind of like a source of energy again? And I think uh, I managed. It wasn't always clear I would manage. There was also kind of like days when I was kind of like the underground academic where I was like, man, like, I'm not sure if I'm going to kind of like continue this. Um, but I think, I think like ultimately, and this is in a sense not kind of like very kind of like Steve Jobs, Instagram style generic stuff, but I think there's still truth in it. I mean, if you encounter a tough moment, I think like what matters much more is like how you manage to kind of like frame it for yourself that it can also become something that's actually uh, that gives you more fuel for kind of like the next steps. Huh?
I've mentioned this recently on another podcast, but it's, when thinking about what a good life is, I've had to write at one point, uh, depression, anxiety, jail for one interviewee in particular, divorce. These were all parts of other different people's good lives, depending on how they respond to them. And there's something, I know there is something kind of eternally redeeming about life, that these experiences can shape us in ways that we wouldn't take back at a later point in life, even though in the moment of it we never ever would have wished for it. I think there's, when thinking about that kind of pragmatism and idealism, there's something in that I think kind of encompasses both for me.
I agree, and I think I mean it's very cliche to say, but there's so much truth in it that obviously you have to. There're going to be some hardship throughout your life, and let's be honest, I've had very limited hardship. I'm extremely privileged, but there got to be some hardship in your life in order to also appreciate the moments where things are falling in place. And I think the folks, or I think in general, like you can probably only have like a permanent good life. I don't think there's such thing as a permanent good life. I think there's always going to be
Yeah.
ups and downs. But if you have a bit of a moment of a good life, it's probably also because you had a bit of a moment of having a shitty life, and then you appreciate when things turn again. Huh?
Yeah, it's an unavoidable realization. I think if you give this life enough contemplation, that without the contrast, you wouldn't know the other side of something. When you've just mentioned a few times how just the significance of autonomy in life, obviously this is something that comes through very strongly for you. Can you give me a sense of when that most clearly became apparent to you that that was something that you valued?
It's a fantastic question. So let me let me think about it while I talk about it. So I think it became very evident for me that it's a theme also in my late teens, early kind of like 20s, where I was very active actually in politics. Another kind of like identity I had at some point. I was a local politician in my hometown and county. And I was part of the Liberal Party of Germany, the FDP party that's in a pretty dire state these days. But obviously for the German Liberal Party, like the core theme uh, has always been uh, liberty, and with that also kind of like autonomy, right? So I think there's an element of like where it became very strong was probably also through the brainwashing that any kind of like political party will do to you. But obviously, I mean, I wouldn't have joined the party if it hadn't been something, if it hadn't been kind of like a theme for me before, right? And I think one pivotal moment for me probably was I spent my 11th grade, not in my small hometown in Germany, but I spent that in Colorado Springs in the United States. Um, in a host family that was extremely conservative, and in a host family that you probably say kind of like today they're part of the MAGA movement. Yeah. So, and that was a very shaping experience for me because I just had never kind of like experienced these kinds of worldviews before. Um, because the family I came from was very kind of like left, kind of like liberal, right? And yeah, this family was damn conservative, and exposing me to views I'd never seen before. And I think what in a sense, and I still got along with them, but what still bugged me a lot about their worldviews was the kind of like um, the many constraints I felt that this conservative worldview was putting up on people. This started from like um, comments regarding LGBTQ plus to comments of like what's the role of a woman in a family. There was always this notion that a woman in the family should be very kind of like submissive. So there was a lot of the opposite of autonomy that I experienced in that host family. And when I returned to Germany, I was very politicized, and basically like literally like 2 weeks after I returned, I said, okay, I gotta become active politically. I asked all of the like youth wings of the political parties to send me materials. I read all of them and said liberalism, emphasizing autonomy is kind of like what I feel is like I want to stand up for. So I guess that was probably the most pivotal moment, if you want to say so. This year I spent in the US that shaped this extremely strong appreciation that autonomy is an important value, not just for me but for everyone. Right? That people should be free to do what they want to do as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. It may offend other people. That's completely fine. It just may not kind of like hurt them.
Well, what was, just out of interest, what was it like to be in that constellation for a period of time?
So um, it taught me tolerance, which I think is a value that we don't emphasize enough these days, in the sense that you can like people and at the same time have very different opinions. Yeah? So it taught me tolerance. And it also helped me forge extremely strong bonds with the very few liberals and diehard Democrats I would find in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I went to a high school, actually, on an Air Force Academy, Air Academy High School. So you can imagine if you were like on a military base going to high school, the kind of like political environment you're in. But there was still something like 5 to 10% of kind of like folks that would identify as a lot more liberal, and yeah, that forged great friendships and certainly shaped. I think my and this is like 20 years ago now, or 19 years ago now. It shaped, I think, my kind of like perspectives for the decades to come.
Yeah, I'm not going to take it on too much of a tangent, but I do find it kind of fascinating that differing views for a long time in my life, I'm 42 now, made no real bearing on whether I might like someone or I'd be friends with them. It seems to be far more polarized these days, and for a multitude of maybe obvious reasons. But really intrigued, though, you mentioned earlier when you were around 17 thinking about the impact that you might have by shaping certain policies. And you talk about then just there, like, you come back from this experience, and maybe it even echoes that kind of desire to move things from the abstract to application as well. But just there seems to be a very strong tendency or movement towards action once you observe something or realize something. Is that always been something that has been quite apparent within you, like that there is some desire to move things towards some action or sense of impact?
Yes, I think that's always been a theme, a bias to action. I call it, yeah, bias to action. If you ask me what really drives me nuts is if people. It's good to understand the problem. It's good to design a solution, but I think in the end of the day, you'll only know if something works if you try it out. So I'm very agile in that, and I always try to jump into the um, solution mode as fast as possible. I modeled. You may have seen my book I also wrote about my PhD. It's called The Lean PhD, Radically Improve the Efficiency, Quality, and Impact of Your Research, where basically the core idea is modeled a bit on the lean startup, that what stops academia is that academia oftentimes just shoes on the problem and is very perfectionist and is very afraid to, many academics are very afraid to share something that's half ready. And what I did throughout my entire PhD is I always shared stuff that was maybe even just a quarter ready, because I said, if I'm stuck, let me go to someone who actually knows this stuff, give me feedback, and then I'm going to be much, much faster in terms of improving the output, right? So I think this, this bias to action and this moving towards action in a co-creation mode via iteration is indeed something that that's very much kind of like inside me, and where I can't kind of like stop myself from operating in that way. Huh?
How did you come to realize that quite soon in life? Then the significance of doing that, because once again, it seems so obvious towards the speed of something if you can acknowledge those things.
Yeah. So I think like this approach of iterating, putting out a solution, testing it, refining it, etc. Honestly, I think what shaped me most here was my first 17 months at McKinsey. The 17 months I spent at McKinsey to get the money for my PhD, because McKinsey is an organization that's really built around this idea of coming up with a solution rapidly. So there's this thing in McKinsey, it's called the day one hypothesis, where basically you start a project, and then the partner on the project, these days it's me, is going to ask the team, you don't know anything about the project, write down the solution. Write down the solution, and you have to write down kind of like your 10, 12 hypotheses of the solution. And then the partner will send you off and basically will ask you to test, falsify your assumptions. And oftentimes you realize that all of the 12 hypotheses you had, they were all wrong. Yeah. But still, by the very fact that you're forced to think about the solution early on and kind of like iterate it, you're just getting kind of like to a great solution much, much faster. Right. So having seen that in my kind of like 17 months of McKinsey is an extremely powerful approach to also crack the the trickiest problems you could think about, really then also shaped how kind of like I approached my PhD and how I do academia until today, which is always this like, let's not be perfectionist. Let's try to get something out there as soon as possible. And then let's get the user's feedback, which may be the readers, which may be um, the, the folks that the research is about. Because I'm very much convinced that actually not just always gets you to the result much more quickly, but I think actually it also gives you a solution that's much more beautiful because you've incorporated these kind of like the wisdom of the numbers.
I think I've read this in something you wrote recently, just in terms of letting go of that sense of perfectionism. You also mentioned in terms of academia as well. Is that something that you would that would have been part of you too? Was there a time in life where, or was there a time in life where you felt much more precious about some sense of perfection, or how would you kind of think about that?
So honestly, I think I've never been a perfectionist. Just the opposite. I had to teach myself to sometimes be a perfectionist, especially kind of like in the earlier days of your life. As a junior consultant, as a PhD researcher, you have to be very perfectionist. I mean, you're the one who has to make sure every sentence is beautiful. There's no calculation mistakes in the Excel sheet. So I had to teach it myself, like to be a perfectionist. But I think my inner drive, in a sense, probably again driven kind of like how I grew up, or kind of like what my parents kind of like showcased, has always been to be more on the kind of like on the pragmatic side of things, right? And rather do 5 things at 80% than do one thing at 100%. Huh?
Just when going back to that original question of the knowledge to application and the idea of moving from abstract to application, where do you sense we are more broadly in terms of getting the balance?
Yeah, I think it's one of the core challenges of our time. I think many feel that there's a real gap between what academia is doing and what practice is doing. And I think we see this also um, in the distrust that some chunks of society these days have towards academia. And I think it's one of the issues that urgently needs fixing. Because again, in my kind of like ideal world, um, you have the academic system that produces this knowledge that then creates these innovations and creates growth and opportunities for folks out there. And I think many people now share the sense that the academic system, in some parts at least, has become self-referential, and it's circling around itself, and it's not building that bridge to practice any longer. And I, yeah, I think there's is probably a kind of like very long answer to kind of like how to solve that. But let me just give like 2, 3 ideas. Right, I think there's obviously one issue with the incentives that academics face. Why why is it that you're celebrated as an academic for citations of a peer-reviewed paper, and you're much less celebrated if somebody in practice has picked it up, right? Shouldn't it be that if you're evaluated, folks also look at how many times have you been cited in practitioner reports? Is there any practitioner that's kind of like picked up your ideas, turned that into a company, turned that into jobs, etc. Right? So I really think I once wrote this article. It's called "Prof, No One Is Reading You," with Asad K. Biswas, the professor who inspired me to go into hydropower dams, where we basically also said, like, shouldn't it be that a professor gets as much credit for an article in The Guardian as the professor gets for an article in kind of like Nature, right? So this participation in the public discourse, I think that's one of the big kind of like chunks to tackle to make sure that also society looks more positively again at what the academic system is doing. And again, I think it also actually talking about a good life, I think it would also make the life of academics even better, because I think there's nothing that gives you as much energy as seeing that those wild ideas you came up with in the ivory tower actually also have some kind of application in practice.
I think that sounds like a beautiful idea, though. The success of a paper or the way it's determined, if like thinking of the real world consequences within that. Like, did this become a business, or did this spark an idea for a movement or something of this nature? For you, when you think of, just over the course of the number of things you've said, like the things that give you energy in this life, following your interests, whether it's the significance of autonomy, whether it's, you know even that moment when you're in talking to the people in that David and Goliath scenario, and you just see the energy of what they're doing irrespective of the odds, and that sentiment you mentioned earlier, and better ask for forgiveness than permission. Really curious to ask you, Julian, the question of what is a good life for you?
So I think there's a couple of themes in that. I think we touched on pretty much all of them here. I think a good life for me is a life that allows to learn, that allows for curiosity. For that, you need a diversity of experience. So I think also a good life, in a sense, you could say, requires diversity of experience, maybe even a portfolio of identities. I think good life requires autonomy, and for that, you also need to have. That's maybe, I think, the only thing we haven't touched explicitly. I think there's also a need to not give a damn, right? I think in order to uh, be truly autonomous, um, you can have autonomy kind of like on paper, but then you still have all of these kind of like demands, right? And if you care too much about them, you actually, even if you're on paper having a lot of autonomy, in reality you still don't have autonomy. So I think this, in the end, also kind of like sometimes not giving a damn, also being conscious about the fact that you don't give a damn. I think that's also very fundamental uh, to having a good life. Huh?
It reminds me of someone who talked about freedom before, and freedom from the opinions of others being a very considerable part, even if you have physical freedom in your life. I usually end on that question of what is a good life, Julian, but you did remind me of something that I wanted to ask you about earlier, and I forgot to. You use the term expression. You use the expression of identities in both the context of your corporate career, and then also academically as well. It sounded like you were holding identities in a quite a light and playful way. I was really curious to ask you just what that interplay between you and identities and just the way you named it. What was the significance of that for you in the context of a good life?
Yeah, I think you're correct that I look at identities, professional identities, also a bit in a playful way. I think, as I said, I think there can be a source of autonomy. I think can be a source of autonomy. But let me also touch maybe on one point I haven't mentioned in this initial list of like what's a good life, which is I think also if you have a kind of like portfolio of identities, it also allows you to drive impact. It also allows you to drive impact in more ways, because sometimes like changing your hat can make a big difference in kind of like the push you're making. And I think to me also come back to your question of like what's a good life. I think in the end of the day, you probably also want to uh, look back at your life, and also like think about like what is it that you've kind of like shaped for broader society in a positive sense. And again, I think these like couple of identities, they can be one avenue, as can be kind of like curiosity and permanent learning, to make sure you also don't just have a good life for yourself, but maybe also have a good life for other folks, or you help other folks increase the odds for having a good life.
Julian, that brings us to the end of the conversation this morning. I must say, I think there's so many wonderful interplays between different things. And I think that really contributes to just a wide variance of views or experience that seem to contribute to your own version of a good life. So thank you very much for joining us on the What is a Good Life podcast today.
Thank you, Mark, for the conversation, and let's keep in touch.